Okay, so I've made this explain everything primarily for my Berwick kids because our classes were so interrupted this week. So this PowerPoint is going through all of the dot points and the tips and tricks that you need to remember. It also is going to go through the major structures that you might find within this SAC, okay? So just in terms of the SAC, remember it is 15 MC and it is 35 marks worth of short answer, okay? So it's not going to be a big SAC. I think there are about 7 to 8 questions in total, and the marks range from about 2 to let's say about 9 marks. Okay, so you are going to have some big questions in there. All right, so let's have a look at these dot points. So dot point 1 is the role of the neuron, more specifically the dendrites, axon, myelin, and axon terminals, as the primary cell involved in the reception and transmission of information across the synapse, excluding details related to signal transduction. So essentially, what you need to know here is what these things, we might change the color, what these things here, what they do. And you need to know that in reference to both receiving and transmitting information across the synaptic gap. All right, let's have a look at some tips and tricks. Okay, so pretty much with this dot point here, this is really basic, okay? You need to know that you need to know how to label these diagrams here. But more specifically, I'm really interested in, I suppose, the terminology that you're using. So just remember that when we are talking about neurons, we are talking about them in terms of the presynaptic neuron. So this is before the gap. And postsynaptic neuron, and that is after the gap. Just remember that both neurons can be pre or postsynaptic neurons, okay? It just depends on where that, I suppose, structure sits before or after the gap. So whether it is a dendritic spine or if it's an axon terminal, okay? The other thing that you should know is, I guess, how information travels from your dendrites to your terminal buttons, okay? You should also know, so I should say that's within the neuron, and that's an electrical message. And you should also know how information travels between a neuron. So from the terminal buttons or the axon terminals of the presynaptic neuron to the dendritic spine of the postsynaptic neuron. So that is between neurons, and that's a chemical message. Essentially, what you should be doing, regardless of these structures, when we talk about how information travels within or between, is you should be hitting your major structures as outlined by the VCAS study design, okay? So we're talking about the dendrites, the axon, the myelin sheath, and the axon terminals, if we're talking within. If we're talking between, obviously we're talking about the axon terminal of the presynaptic neuron, the synaptic gap, and the dendritic spine, or the receptors on the dendritic spine of the postsynaptic neuron. If you're unsure of that process, just make sure that you are able to label and draw the diagram, and that's actually going to help you conceptualize all the main structures and what points that you should be hitting. Dot point 2 is the role of neurotransmitters in the transmission of neural information between neurons. More specifically, we're looking at the lock and key process to produce either an excitatory effects, as with glutamate, or inhibitory effects, as with GABA. So essentially what this is looking at here is, what is the lock and key process? You should know this structure really, really well, okay? Please make sure you know that. You should know the difference between an excitatory or inhibitory effect, and you should know examples of neurotransmitters that, I guess, exhibit both excitatory or inhibitory effects, so glutamate and GABA. Okay, so in this dot point, we are focusing primarily on the synapse. So we know that the impulse that travels between neurons, it's a chemical message, okay? And so when we're talking about the synapse itself, remember we always have to talk about it in terms of three parts. We are talking about the terminal button of the presynaptic neuron. We talk about the synaptic gap or the synaptic cleft, you can say either, and we're talking about the dendritic spine on the postsynaptic neuron. If you ever have a diagram, you must always, I suppose, identify each of these fully. And when you're using structures like the lock and key process, or if you just talk about neural communication in between two neurons, then you should always make an effort to make sure you're fully talking about each of those structures, okay? So that wording is really important. So the next thing that we need to talk about is more specifically the lock and key process. It's really important that we are understanding that process, and it's really important that you know that structure. So you must identify which part represents the lock and what is the key. So we know that the neurotransmitter is the key and the receptor site is the lock. We know that the neurotransmitter has a chemically distinct shape, whereas the receptor site has a complementary shape. We know that the neurotransmitter searches for the complementary receptor site and then binds to it. So it binds, and then that unlocks the postsynaptic neuron. Now, this can have either an excitatory effect, which means it stimulates or activates the postsynaptic neurons to fire, or you can say it makes a postsynaptic neuron more likely to fire, or it will have an inhibitory effect, which means that it will block or prevent the postsynaptic neuron from firing, or makes it less likely to fire, okay? Now, you need to make sure that you know what your examples are, okay? So we know that glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. It makes the postsynaptic neuron more likely to fire. We know that GABA, for example, is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It makes the postsynaptic neuron less likely to fire. Okay, dot point 3. We're looking at the roles of the different divisions of the nervous system. So more specifically, we're looking at the central and peripheral nervous systems, as well as their associated subdivisions. So obviously talking about the somatic nervous system, the autonomic, etc., in responding to, integrating, and coordinating with sensory stimuli received by the body, okay? So the one thing I want you to remember about this dot point, it's not so much about what each of these things do, so the specific or separate roles of the nervous systems, it's how do these roles integrate to allow us to receive sensory information and then respond to it in a holistic way. So what we're looking at here is more holistic scenarios. So let's have a look, shall we? Okay, first things first. Please make sure that you are not abbreviating. So don't abbreviate any of these nervous system labels, okay? I want to see central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, so on and so forth. If you run out of time, you can say like somatic NS. that's okay. But that first part, I really need you to do it holistically or like fully for me, okay? Now, the reason is because, for example, there are two S's. So like if you're responding to a question and you're saying the S and S, I don't know if you are meaning the somatic nervous system or the sympathetic nervous system, okay? So just make sure that you are not using abbreviations. Look, you need to know the functions of these nervous systems. I don't really want you to know their definitions. I want you to know what they do. And I want you to know how they work together, okay? One thing that you can look at is in your blue booklets, I believe there were some integrated scenarios that we did together. That would be really good for you guys to look at, okay? So we're not just looking at like, you know, like in isolation what the somatic nervous system does. We're looking at how like the somatic nervous system might work with the central nervous system to elicit some kind of response, okay? Just remember that when you're looking at multiple choice questions or even just short answer questions, it's important to be specific, okay? So like if we're talking about a voluntary motor movement, of course you're going to want to talk about the somatic nervous system rather than the peripheral nervous system. Now in a multiple choice question, if the question is asking about like voluntary motor movement, but the somatic nervous system is not one of your alternatives, then of course you would go the peripheral nervous system. As we know, the somatic nervous system is a division of the peripheral nervous system. Just a couple of other things that I'd like you to remember. Don't forget that the somatic nervous system has two roles, the sensory role and the motor role, okay? The other thing to recognize is that we would actually say that the somatic and the autonomic nervous system, I might just change colors here, these two ones, these are complementary, okay? The somatic nervous system is voluntary, and this allows us to initiate a response where the autonomic nervous system regulates things, okay? So it regulates functions of internal muscles, organs, and glands, okay? We would also say that the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, they are complementary as well, okay? And this is all to do with changing our bodily functions in times of stress, okay? So the sympathetic nervous system is initiated when we perceive there to be a stressor, okay? Now, all sorts of things happen, and I would like you to know two changes that occur and how they allow survival. So for example, the ones I like are pupils dilating. So pupils dilate to let more light into the eye, and this will allow you to see better when you're running away from the predator, okay? The other one I like is inhibition of digestion, okay? So your digestion system, it stops or it shuts down, and that will allow energy to be rerouted to body parts that need it most. For example, it will allow energy to be rerouted to your muscles so you can run away from the predator faster, okay? Now, the parasympathetic nervous system, again, is complementary to the sympathetic nervous system, and it has two roles. It restores the body to normal functioning once the threat has passed. So once you have like been in that fist fight, or once you've kind of gotten away from that target that was chasing you, your parasympathetic nervous system is going to regain control. It also maintains homeostasis, which is just your normal state of functioning, okay? When you are sitting in your study chair on a day-to-day basis or in the classroom, your body should be in homeostasis, okay? So our parasympathetic nervous system is dominant most of the time. Okay, let's have a go at this question. So Pam is participating in an experiment that involves sorting beads into groups or wearing a blindfold. The first part of this task involves Pam picking up each of the bead and deciding whether it is rough or smooth. The second part of this task involves Pam placing the bead in the appropriate group. What type of neuron is responsible for enabling Pam to tell if the bead is rough or smooth? Okay, so remember, we know that the sensory neuron allows us to do that, okay? Now, just a tip, remember SAME. Sensory is also known as afferent. Motor is also known as efferent, okay? In VCA, they can call sensory neurons afferent neurons and vice versa, okay? So identify the main functions performed by Pam's CNS, so the sensory nervous system, while she carries out each task. So what would the central nervous system do? So task 1, the central nervous system would process the sensory information to decide if the bead was rough or smooth, okay? So we'd process sensory info. And then what it will do is it will initiate a voluntary motor movement to allow Pam to place the bead in the correct group, okay? Now, remember when we're talking about, or when we're doing scenario work, you always have to make sure you are linking it back to the scenario. I haven't done this because I'm being lazy, but just remember, always refer back to the task at hand and use the person's name, okay? And that will get you your application. Okay, dot point 4. We are looking at the distinction, that means difference, between conscious and unconscious responses by the nervous system to sensory stimuli, including the role of the spinal reflex, okay? So we want to know 2 things. We want to know the difference between conscious and unconscious responses and what the spinal reflex is. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to know the difference between conscious and unconscious responses. You can use this table to help you, okay? When you're giving difference, please don't use words like conscious or unconscious. You are not going to get points for that. You would want to use words like voluntary or involuntary, okay? Look, just make sure that you have a vague idea holistically of what each of these things do. So a conscious response is it's voluntary, okay? So these involve things like opening a door, or like I don't know, choosing to eat a piece of cake. Whereas your unconscious responses, they tend to be involuntary. So we're talking about things like salivation, okay? Or like the secretion of adrenaline, or your heart rate increasing. Yeah, so our conscious responses tend to, not always, they tend to involve your somatic nervous system, whereas your unconscious responses tend to involve your autonomic nervous system, okay? I wouldn't use that as a difference though. The other thing that you should know is the steps involved in the spinal reflex and why it occurs. Remember, this is adaptive, okay? The reason the spinal reflex is adaptive is because it allows the message to travel faster to your body parts that is in danger, and that's a terrible way of saying it, but essentially what it does is it reduces the time that your body part will be spent, I guess, in contact with the thing that's hurting it, okay? So it allows you to survive, yeah? Please make sure that you're referring to the spinal cord, not the spine, so spinal cord, not spine. And when you are talking about this process here, you need to make sure that your terminology is good, okay? If you're saying things like sensory message, you must also, sensory neuron, you must also say sensory message. So what I kind of want to see is I want to see the receptor. I want to see the sensory neurons carrying a sensory message to the interneurons, which will relay information to the motor neurons. The motor neurons will send a motor message to the muscle, and the muscle will contract and take the hand off the fry pan or whatever, okay? So we always must use receptors, sensory neurons, sensory message, interneurons, motor message, muscle will contract, okay? That is your basic flow. Always apply to the scenario. All right, let's have a go at that one there, okay? Okay, so Serena was sitting in the garden and playing when she felt something crawl onto her leg. She saw that it was a bee and brushed it away. Shortly after, she involuntarily kicked out her leg, then felt a stinging sensation that made her scream loudly. She then realized she'd been stung by a bee, okay? Now, what we see here is an example of a conscious response and an unconscious response, okay? We see the conscious response in the fact that she's brushing away a bee, okay? Then we see something that is involuntary or an unconscious response, i.e. she kicks out her leg and after the fact she feels the stinging sensation. Now we know that's an example of a spinal reflex because she's actually, I suppose, she's moved her leg prior or before she's actually realized that she's been stung, okay? And that is a dead giveaway that is a spinal reflex. Let's have a look at these questions. So identify the division of the nervous system and type of response when she brushed the bee off, okay? So the division is the somatic nervous system. And this is a voluntary or a conscious response. And then our second question is, in terms of the nervous system, name and explain Serena's response when she kicked her leg. We know that this is a spinal reflex. What I would encourage you to do is I would encourage you to think of each point like a neuron that is involved, okay? So we've got sensory, inter, and motor, okay? Essentially what's going to happen is the sensory receptors in Serena's leg would detect the sting and then transfer the information to her sensory neurons. The sensory neurons will send a sensory message to the interneurons in the spinal cord in the central nervous system. So the interneurons in spinal cord. So the interneurons will relay the message to the motor neurons, and then the motor neurons relay message. So the motor neurons will send a motor message to the leg or to the muscles in Serena's leg, and then she would involuntarily kick her leg out, okay? So a few things to remember. Make sure you are hitting sensory receptors, sensory neurons and message, which go to the interneurons in the spinal cord. If we're referencing a spinal reflex, you must say spinal cord, not the spine, okay? This will relay the message to the motor neurons, and we're also hitting motor neurons motor message, okay, which will result in her involuntary kicking out her leg. So just make sure you've got that theoretical stuff, okay, but also make sure that you are adding your application to the question, okay? So tell me who the person is. Tell me what pain they've received and where that is. Tell me how the motor response is being enacted, okay? Okay, so this is dot point 5. So the effects of chronic changes to the functioning of the nervous system due to interference to neurotransmitter function, as illustrated by the role of dopamine in Parkinson's disease. Okay, now, what we're looking at here is, of course, Parkinson's disease, but the dot point is explicitly saying that we need to look at how dopamine has a role in the changes in the nervous system when people suffer from Parkinson's disease. So what we're looking at here is that underlying biological, I guess, connection between low levels of dopamine and motor symptoms, okay? The other things that you might kind of want to think about when you study is how we actually treat or manage those motor symptoms. So remember, this is basically biological stuff here. We're not really interested in things like risk factors or non-motor symptoms, although that might be good for you to know. We're focusing on that neurotransmitter function primarily. Okay, the first thing to know is that Parkinson's is idiopathic, okay? I don't think that's how you spell idiopathic, but whatever. So idiopathic means that we don't know exactly what causes the neurons in the substantia nigra to die, okay? And so what that means is that we can't actually cure Parkinson's disease. All we can actually do is manage the symptoms, okay? Now, as I said before, this dot point is mainly concerned with the changes in the brain, okay? So this is a really, really good structure to know. I would make sure you know it very, very, very well. So we know that the dopamine-producing neurons in the substantia nigra die or they degenerate. I like die, it's easy to say. Therefore, less dopamine is released. There are less messages sent regarding voluntary motor movement, or you can say that neurons fire uncontrollably, and this will make it difficult to regulate voluntary motor movement, for example, and you might talk about certain symptoms, okay? Look, this is typically a 3-point response if you're just talking about the biological changes in the brain and how they relate to Parkinson's. If it's a 4-point response, you definitely want to be talking about your symptoms, and you might want to outline that symptom too. So I don't want you to just, name it. Like I don't want you to say tremors. I want you to actually tell me what that actually is, okay? The other thing I want you to recognize is that when we manage Parkinson's disease, we do so with drugs, okay? We wouldn't do it with surgery. That's a whole different kettle of fish. So what we're talking about here is using a dopamine agonist. Now, what this does is this mimics dopamine. And it makes the neurons more likely to fire. And that on the whole will manage those symptoms that are motor, okay? Just 2 things in terms of knowing the symptoms. Make sure you know, look, ideally all of the motor symptoms really well, but in a pinch, know 2 really well. You should also know at the very least 2 non-motor symptoms, okay? Okay, let's have a go at this question. Describe the role of dopamine in Parkinson's disease. Pretty easy, it's 3 points. Okay, so first and foremost, I want you to talk about what dopamine does, okay? So dopamine is responsible for controlling smooth voluntary motor movements. So controls voluntary motor movements. Make sure that you are saying voluntary motor or muscle movement, okay? You have to be specific here, okay? So secondly, in Parkinson's, dopamine-producing neurons in the substantia nigra die and dopamine levels decrease. So I want you to talk about what happens in the substantia nigra and how this means that there are lower levels of dopamine. Okay, now, then what happens is this means the neurons will fire uncontrollably, and this will mean in turn that voluntary muscle movements are not regulated properly, okay? And that will result in motor symptoms such as tremors, okay? So neurons fire uncontrollably which means can't regulate voluntary motor movement, which equals symptoms e.g. tremor. Look, what I would encourage you to do is always have like 4 points, okay? So pretty much what we're saying is neurons that produce dopamine in a substantial negro die, which lowers levels of dopamines, okay? Dopamine. The neurons will fire uncontrollably, and this will mean that we cannot rate, or Parkinson's sufferers cannot control voluntary motor movement. This results in some kind of motor symptom, okay? So if you have those 4 points, then you're going to be fine. Okay, dot point 6. All right, so we're looking at sources of stress, whether it be eustress or distress, including daily pressures, life events, culture stress, major stress, and catastrophes that disrupt whole communities. Okay, so remember, we are looking at stress. So there is a difference between a stressor, so something that induces stress, which is that tension caused by a stressor, and then the stress reaction. Remember, stress reactions fall into one of 4 categories: physical and or psychological, whether that be affective, which is our A, so emotional, behavioral, or cognitive, okay? So physical stress reaction will be anything initiated by your fight, flight, freeze response, like increased heart rate, okay? Or like a headache. Affective or emotional is becoming sad or depressed or manic. Behavioral is eating too much or too little, sleeping more or less, and having irrational outbursts. And cognitive is things like having poor attention span or poor memory, okay? So we have different kinds of types of stress. We have eustress, which is a positive psychological response to a stressor, and distress, so a negative psychological response to a stressor. Remember, these are a psychological response to stress, and you need to make sure that these definitions are word perfect. They both activate the same sympathetic nervous system response, okay? So despite them being different psychological perceptions of the stressor, they both have a non-specific physiological response, i.e. they both elicit the same fight, flight, freeze response. Okay, so you also need to make sure that you know the difference between the sources of stress. So we obviously have daily pressures, which are like just the normal little things. We have life events. And so they are big things, which means you need to adjust them. They can be both positive or negative. A culture of stress is an example, or it falls under a life event. And that's mainly to do with things like culture or immigration and things like that. We then have a major stress, which is an intensely negative kind of event that affects whole communities, and then catastrophes. So they are examples, or they fall under the categories of major stress. Make sure that you know the key characteristics of each of these sources of stress, and make sure you know similarities and differences for each, okay? So for example, if we are going to compare and contrast, let's say, I don't know, like a daily pressure and a life event, a similarity might be that they can both involve negative things, okay? Differences might be that daily pressures tend to be just negative, whereas life events can be both positive or negative, okay? We might also say that life events, they tend to be ongoing, whereas daily pressures tend to be short term, okay? So I would just make sure I know like 1 similarity and 2 differences for each of these sources of stress, okay? What you might do is you might look at the mind map that we did together in class, and see if you can use that to help you kind of come up with those similarities and differences. Okay, let's have a go at this question. So Harry and Carla have started at a new school. Harry is outgoing and sporty, while Carla is shy and reserved. Explain if Carla is more likely to experience eustress or distress on the first day of school. So this is a pretty easy one. So Carla's probably going to experience distress. So she is shy, and so therefore she might have a negative psychological reaction to meeting new people. Okay, now remember, this is a scenario, it has people's names in it. So make sure you're referring back to the scenario and you are referring to the person's name. Okay, so let's have a go at this one. Compare and contrast life events with major stresses. Okay, so we've got 2 marks, so we want one similarity and one difference. Okay, so one similarity might be that they both involve negative stresses. Okay, a difference would be that life events can be positive or negative, while major stresses are always negative. So we've got life events only affect people who are directly involved, while major stresses can also affect family or people outside of it. Major stresses can also often involve life-threatening events, whereas life events do not, okay? So there are lots of different ones that you can kind of think about. Remember, just use that mind map that we went through. Okay, so this is dot point 7. Models of stress as a biological process with reference to Selle's general adaptation syndrome of alarm reaction, including shock and countershock, resistance and exhaustion, including the fight, flight, freeze response and the role of cortisol. Okay, let's start with the fight, flight, freeze response. Just remember that this is adaptive, okay? So it allows our body to, or allows us to survive. Just remember that we need to know what occurs in terms of our body in the fight, flight response, okay? So we want to know 2 changes that occur when the fight, flight response is activated and how it allows us to survive. So remember, I've already been through this before, but I like the pupils and I like the digestion, but you can choose whatever ones that you like, okay? Just remember that the freeze response is a little bit different, okay? So in the freeze response, both the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system is activated. However, the parasympathetic nervous system is dominant in order to conserve energy and avoid detection. So when the organism has avoided detection or they've conserved energy when they can actually escape, then that's when the sympathetic nervous system is reactivated and they can run away as fast as they can, okay? So in terms of cortisol, you should know that this is a stress hormone. It has a lot of different roles, but in terms of stress, short term, it has positive effects, okay? So it will increase energy levels, it will also increase arousal, and it will also help to repair damage in the body in short term, okay? So if cortisol is secreted in small amounts or for a short period of time, then that's a positive thing. If there is excess cortisol, what this means is that there is impaired immune functioning and therefore we have an increased vulnerability to illness. So we're much more likely to get sick. So we might get like colds, a sore throat, flus, things like that. Okay, let's talk about gas. So gas shows the changes in the person's level of resistance to stress over time. So what you should be able to discuss is the biological changes. So we're talking about like cortisol, of course. So psychological and physiological illnesses that may occur, and you should also know like when they occur, so whether it's in resistance or exhaustion, and the strengths and limitations of this model. Okay, just remember that when you're being asked to identify, I suppose, a stage, then you must make sure you're being really specific. So if we're asked to identify a stage like alarm reaction, and it's talking specifically about shock, you might say shock in the alarm reaction stage, okay, not just shock. So let's just talk really quickly about this curve here, okay? So of course, if you're asked to draw this graph, you must be able to draw the whole thing and have like look, make the curve like generally look like this, okay? That's fine. But you need to make sure that you are putting in your line of resistance and you're putting in all of your stages, okay? So alarm reaction, resistance, exhaustion, and you're labeling like the time, and then of course the resistance to stress on the x-axis. So in shock, this is when we first perceive the threat, I suppose. So we first perceive the threat. I might change colours. So we perceive the threat, and here we are below the line of resistance, as we can see here, and this is when our blood pressure might drop, and so therefore we might faint. Okay, so we're not really dealing with a stressor. In the countershock stage, this is when our sympathetic nervous system is activated and both adrenaline and cortisol is secreted, okay? So we begin to be able to deal with a stressor. In resistance, this is where we are dealing with a stressor, and so we are fine. We are coping. We are okay, all right? But only up until like a certain point, as we can see here. Now, in resistance, we are coping, so we are above the line of resistance. Here, there is a continued secretion of cortisol, okay? Now, because that is happening, all of our body functions are not vital for survival, they're shut off, okay? Now, when we have the prolonged secretion of cortisol, so prolonged secretion of cortisol, then what happens is this will decrease the immunity, okay? So the immune system will decrease, and therefore we're more likely to get sick. So we might like get colds, flus, whatever, okay? Now we can see here that our immunity to disease is starting to decline, and in exhaustion we have no resources anymore, and so we really can't function very well, okay? Now what you will need to do is you will be given scenarios where you have to identify what stage the person is in, okay? If they're in resistance, they're still coping, so they can still kind of do everything they're meant to do, like go to work, do whatever, be social. So they might be getting things like colds, sore throats, or like the start of the flu. In exhaustion, they are not coping anymore. We can't do the things we would normally do. And this is where you get more intense illnesses like the flu, cancer, heart disease, okay? As well as like psychological illnesses like anxiety, things like that, all right? That looks like a big mess now that I'm looking back at that slide, but what I would suggest you do is you look at those hot questions that I gave you in class, and I think at the beginning of my coping strategies or coping with stress, explain everything, I went through those structures with you explicitly, okay? They are really, really good to look at, and just remember that what you're doing is you are identifying the stage the person's in. You're saying that because they're dealing with a particular stressor, and tell me what the stressor is, there will be prolonged secretion of cortisol. That will result in a decreased immunity, and therefore they're more likely to get sick, or they're more susceptible of getting sick or getting like the flu or the cold or whatever, okay? So you must make sure you know that particular structure. All right, let's have a look at this one. So complete the table and put the stage of the general adaptation syndrome as it applies to each level of cortisol. So sustained levels of cortisol immobilize the body and increase arousal levels to respond to the stressor. So that is going to be resistance. Okay, release of cortisol mobilizes the body and increases arousal levels to respond to the stressor. That specifically is counter shock. But this question is not asking about the substage. It's actually asking about the overall stage. So it's going to be alarm reaction. And then depleted levels of cortisol reduce the ability of the body to respond to further stresses, and that is exhaustion. Okay, so draw a curve in the graph below that represents the change of the body's resistance to stress over time. This is 3 marks. So essentially probably what you're wanting is probably 1 mark for each stage. I would encourage you to put in where your shock and your counter shock is going to be. So look, what I'm going to say is the graph must first start at the normal level of resistance, so it shouldn't be above or below the line, okay? So during alarm reaction, the level of resistance is below normal, but by the end it's back to normal. So I would just go like this. I would just go like that. Whoops, that's terrible. I'm going to change colors because that's not right. So we're going to go below the line and then above. So that's kind of what I would draw. But look, as long as it's above normal in counter shock, then you're going to be fine. In resistance, of course, it's going to be above normal and it's going to peak in the middle and then it's going to start to decrease. In resistance, the line should be above the line of resistance. Sorry, the curve should be above the line of resistance. And then towards the end, it's going to go below the normal level of resistance, okay? Because it's not until like, I guess, the middle stage of exhaustion that you really aren't coping with stress anymore. Okay, let's have a look at this question. So this is about Stan who suffers a heart attack because he's had a stressful work environment. We're looking at the role of cortisol in weakening the immune system in terms of a stressful situation. And so we're explaining how Stan's physiological arousal, so cortisol, can both help and lead to problems, okay? So we've got 1 mark for how it will be helpful and 1 mark for how it will hinder. So look, we know that in the short term, the secretion of cortisol will increase arousal and it can also repair damage on the short term. I think for this question here, increasing arousal is probably going to be an easy one to respond to, okay? Remember, this is scenario based, so we must make sure we're referring back to the scenario. So we might say that cortisol increases glucose levels to provide an immediate source of energy, and this will mean that Stan is more able to cope with his stressful work environment, okay? In terms of the how it leads to problems or how it hinders, you might say that prolonged release of cortisol weakens the immune system, which means that he is more susceptible to disease like heart attack, okay? So I might just very quickly write this down for you and you can, well, then we'll just move on. So increases arousal means he can cope better stressful environment. And then prolonged secretion of cortisol reduces immunity to disease, e.g. Stan is more likely to suffer a heart attack. All right, let's move on. Okay, so this is the second last dot point. So this is dot point 8. Models of stress as a psychological process with reference to Lazarus and Folkman's transactional model of stress and coping. More specifically, we're looking at the primary and the secondary appraisal. Okay, so remember that with this model, stress is subjective, okay? So when we talk about Lazarus and Folkman, this is the first thing you should always be saying if you've got a question that looks at the difference between two persons' stress response, okay? So if the event is significant in the primary appraisal, make sure you first identify it as stressful, and then you talk about the type of kind of stress it might be, okay? When you are applying the primary appraisal as well as the secondary appraisal, I would say, to a scenario, please make sure that you are giving me keywords, okay? So if it's stressful, then it might be threat. So the damage has not occurred yet, but it might in future. Harm, loss, the damage has already occurred, or challenge, there is an opportunity for growth. And you must always make sure that you apply to the scenario as specifically as you possibly can. In terms of our secondary appraisal, this is more about if our coping strategies are adequate or not, or our resources are adequate or not. So what you actually do is you kind of consider what coping strategies and resources you have available to you, whether they be internal or external. And then if you have enough coping resources, you're like, okay, cool, I can deal with this. If you don't have resources that are adequate, then you might be more stressed, okay? Just make sure you also know at least two strengths and two limitations of this model, and you might also be asked to compare and contrast this model with gas, okay? You must also know how these two models interact. Okay, let's have a go at this question. Stella is currently in year 12. She's feeling overwhelmed by her workload and has been having trouble sleeping. In contrast, her friend Ada is enjoying year 12 and finds it challenging yet manageable. In terms of the primary appraisal, and Lazarus and Folkman's transactional model of stress and coping, explain why Stella and Audrey evaluated their situations differently. So first off, appraisal is subjective. So then what we would do is we would identify what primary appraisal both Stella and Ada are in, and then we would give the keywords and we would apply to the scenario. So Stella, you can say, let's say that she is experiencing harm loss, okay? So where the damage has been done, e.g. she has lost sleep due to school. In comparison, Ada is probably experiencing a challenge. So there is potential for growth. So for example, Ada might get the marks she needs. She needs to get into her dream course at uni, okay? So remember what we're doing is appraisal is subjective, then we're identifying, defining, and applying to both girls. Okay, last dot point 9. We are looking at context-specific effectiveness, coping flexibility, and use of particular strategies, so exercise and approach and avoidance strategies for coping with stress. Okay, so this holistic dot point is about coping strategies and how we evaluate them and modify strategies if they're not effective, okay? So in terms of our coping strategies, we have exercise, approach strategies, and avoidance strategies, okay? You need to make sure with your approach and your avoidance strategies that you know how to define them and apply them in a specific scenario, okay? Normally what we might see is a connection between these types of strategies to the transactional model of stress and coping. Okay, so in the coping, also in the secondary appraisal, they might actually consider what approach and avoidance strategies they have to deal with the stressor. Okay, so that's something to keep in the back of your mind. Just remember that it's important to be able to choose a coping strategy that best suits the individual and the stressor. So avoidance strategies might be the best choice if you're dealing with the emotions or if you can't change the situation. So sometimes they're actually better initially. When we're using approach strategies, this is kind of just to deal with a situation. So I would say that, if you can deal with a situation, these are the best ones to use. But if, for example, a person has cancer, you can't necessarily deal with the underlying stressor. You might just have to deal with your emotions, okay? In terms of exercise, just make sure you know two benefits of exercise in terms of the biological changes. So I would talk about use of excess cortisol and releases endorphins. They're good ones to know. You might also know about the psychological effects of exercise as well. Okay, so we can sometimes call exercise moving meditation because it does have the same effects of meditation in so much as it can actually put you into a state in terms of your brainwaves that is very, very similar to meditation. So we also need to know about context-specific effectiveness and coping flexibility. So context-specific effectiveness is how well the strategy that you've chosen matches the stressor. So if your strategy matches the stressor well, then you're less likely to, of course, be stressed, okay? If your strategy doesn't actually match the stressor, then it's actually going to increase your stress levels, and that's when you might kind of need to use coping flexibility. So coping flexibility is changing the strategies if the need arises. So if your strategy doesn't match the stressor very well, i.e. it's not reducing your stress levels, then you need to be able to evaluate the strategy that you're using, and you need to be able to go, okay, well, I need to change it. If you can do that, you can change the strategy if it's not effective, then that means that you have a high level of coping flexibility. If you just continue with the same strategy, even though it's not really working for you, then that would mean that you have a low level of coping flexibility. So essentially what you want is you want good context-specific effectiveness and a high level of coping flexibility if the need be. And if you have both of those, it means that you have good coping skills. Okay, let's have a look at this one. So Aaron works as a mechanic and his supervisor just increased his work hours, and Aaron feels stressed because he doesn't think he'll be able to spend enough quality time with his children. So for the first question, provide an example of an avoidance strategy and approach strategy that Aaron could use to manage his stress. So this is 2 marks. So 1 and 1. Just make sure that you're always defining and giving an example. So, and with something like this, you'd also want to label which is which. So approach is dealing directly with a stressor. For example, he might quit his job. He might ask for a new roster. He might, I don't know, speak to his partner and think about how the kinds of things that they could do to increase the quality of time spent with his children. Okay. In terms of avoidance, this is not dealing with stressor directly. And so, for example, what he might do is he might just not think about it, he might vent, he might go to sleep, he might drink too much alcohol, okay? So then what we want to do is we want a strength and a limitation of avoidance strategy. So again, make sure you are signposting, otherwise you're not going to get any marks. Tell me explicitly what is the strength and what is the limitation. So a strength, so ignoring a stressor to focus on other things can provide time out from a stressor. And choosing to ignore stresses that can't be changed can reduce anxiety. So they are strengths. Limitations are is that they're only helpful in the short term, and substance use, etc., is bad for mental and physical health. And that is the end of the PowerPoint, or the explain everything. So just make sure if you have any questions, you email me directly. And if you have anything that you want to mark, send them through ASAP. All right, thank you guys.